Smartphone manufacturing capacity is lying idle. Nearly half of India's mobile phone manufacturing capacity, established under the government's Production Linked Incentive Scheme, or PLI, is currently underutilized or repurposed thanks to declining global and domestic demand, according to a report in Business Standard. Capacity is high because there is far more capacity that's been created than there was demand for, including the fact that the domestic market for smartphones has remained the same at around 150 million smartphones for more than 4 years now. Data from research from Counterpoint Research shows that India's mobile phone production capacity reached over 500 million units by the end of 2024. Of this, some 250 million unit capacity is lying idle, and for various reasons which we'll come to. This, of course, has strategic implications and insights for mobile phones in specific, but manufacturing in general, when it comes to tuning for and anticipating both global and domestic demand. Many manufacturers, that Business Standard report said, had shifted to produce telecom equipment or wearables or even shutting production. I reached out to Tarun Pathak, research director at telecom and technology consulting firm Counterpoint Research, and I began by asking him to walk us through what the total capacity versus demand was at right now and why there was this gap.
It's an interesting topic. So we started tracking this manufacturing in India almost like in 2014 when this all started. And there was basically what we look at is it divided into three phases. One is when 2014, 15, 16, when everyone started assembling in India. So that was the time right from two OEMs, Samsung and Nokia, they used to manufacture assembly in India, but then everyone raced to assemble in India. So that was the phase one. And suddenly we have seen a lot of OEMs started partnering with the EMS players, opening up the lines because the cost to assemble a phone was not huge. And then obviously there was some duty deficit as well. And then there was this phase two, which was phase manufacturing program that was launched by government of India, which essentially states that you need to also now just not do local assembling of mobile phones, which is basically you import parts from other countries and merely assembling it here. So you need to basically localize as well. And there were different phases where the components were divided and the duties were levied on that so that the local sourcing starts happening. So that was the phase two. And essentially, we are now in the phase three, which is being driven by PLI, production linked incentive, which essentially states that, okay, now you are doing assembling, you are also locally sourcing something, but now your incentives and everything will be linked to the production of the devices you are doing. So that has basically consolidated operation of a lot of OEMs because to get this incentive, OEMs normally went in favor of couple of EMS players that have the potential to do that or potential to hit the targets. So what we have seen that right from the phase one, when everyone started on their own or smaller players moving towards the larger players like Dixon's or the Foxconn of the world that have an incentive to produce more to qualify for the PLIs. And that transition has led to a lot of these smaller EMS players exiting from the business. So they exited in multiple ways. Either they sold these capacities to the bigger players, or those are like just idle and being converted into different. So as a result of it, we have seen that we have technically a production capacity which is as big as like 500 million to produce 500 million units across feature phones, smartphones and tablets. Currently the production output is only 250 million, which is necessarily the half of which is being utilized. Technically we can scale our manufacturing assembling to that level, but the point here is right now it is largely being driven by domestic consumption. Like for example, whatever India is producing, it is meant for domestic consumption, and export is only 20% of it, and being done only by two major players, Samsung and Apple. So I think the export part is a miss here, and that obviously with certain capacity and the domestic demand, you can only produce that much. You can sit on a surplus.
Right. So let me pick up on two or three points you made. So one is you said that a lot of small players were absorbed by larger players. So the gross or the aggregate capacity is still the same, right?
Yes. So either it largely remains the same, or they're still looking at what to do with these smaller factories. So, for example, there are even smaller players like no one even like very few people have heard. Like, for example, you have companies like Cohort, Consort Digital, Creators Corporation, Excellence Mobile Tech, KBR. So that list goes on to almost like 62 to 65 players. But then, as the rule of industry is like top five is almost like top six is almost like 90-95% of the market.
So these factories were like subcontracted earlier, or were they OEMs in?
Subcontractors. OEMs were very few, like Vivo had their own, used to have their own, and then Oppo, Samsung has their own. They were not doing for others. Mainly, although the Oppo is doing for their sub brands as well, like Realme and not sub brand, but technically, yeah, they're doing for OnePlus.
Right. So therefore, there are two different things. So one is you're saying a lot of smaller factories which came up as subcontractors to larger ones have got absorbed because they couldn't survive as standalone entities. And the second is aggregate capacity of the larger ones now, which includes the smaller ones, is only working at about 50%.
So what also happened, what this PLI did, so let's say I'm a factory X and I started with a certain OEM, let's say OEM A, and that OEM A was giving entire capacity to me earlier, let's say 4 million per unit. So I have that capacity working for that OEM. So I build a factory which has a capacity to produce at least 5 because I always want to keep it a buffer. But now that OEM, what it did, it started to diversify. Instead of going with that EMS X, it says like, hey, let me go to EMX Y and Z as well, because these are the two EMS that also qualify for the PLI, and maybe I'll get some. So so now what happened now, that EMS X can't basically shut down its own capacity because it thinks that maybe I'll win over some of the business from other EMS. So it is still idle, but again, the point is we are utilizing 100% of local demand through this assembling, but only 20% of the export is being met.
And which is mostly Apple and Samsung, as you said. So, what's the likely outcome of this? The fact that we have so much spare capacity at this point, and with the market only growing very slowly, even if it is.
Right. So there could be two alternatives to it. One is like you increase your export, because export, technically, if you look at China, is exporting almost like a billion phones, right, from their manufacturing. And it's a manufacturing powerhouse of the world. Let's say if Trump government comes into power and there is some kind of tariff barriers, so India stands advantage, right? So you still have those geopolitical China plus one strategy that everyone is looking at, maybe comes in favor of India. And India's export, India still has a huge export potential. I believe we are still scratching at the top of the surface, because none of this, think of it as like Chinese brands have 75% market share in India, but only 2% in terms of export contribution, which is like they can technically export from India because in PLI they were not being given the benefits. Let's say Oppo's own factory, Vivo's own factory, but now things are changing. Vivo has partnered with, like, it's a JV with Dixon in that. And then we have seen Transient going to a similar route where Dixon has bought the taken over the iSmart, which is again their factory. So these things are happening. But if let's say India, that is currently doing almost like 50 million of export right now, imagine that number becomes 4 times in couple of years, then we are somewhere 250 million internal demand, 200 million exports, will be somewhere closer to 450.
Assuming what you're saying is that the technical capacity to produce those phones capable of exports or to meet export requirements in the case of, let's say, an Apple or a Samsung, which is higher end, is already there. But my other question is what was the expectation when all of this capacity was being created at such speed? I mean, was there an expectation that we'll hit 500 million phones of in terms of manufacture?
I think everyone saw it in a silo basis. So everyone, like all these factories, players, they didn't see this because the duties were 20% it all started. 20% duty is huge. And then everyone thought, okay, we'll get some mix of like smaller models. Feature phone market was big at that time, and then feature phone also declined. So everyone thought like, okay, maybe we'll cater to some, and it's an easy model in a sense, like you start a factory. I think margins are still in 1 to 2 to 3% in that, but and number of like investment is like 5 to 6 crores to start a line basically. So barriers to entry was low, and then they all started. But then market also went into consolidation. India market is still at very similar level as we were during the COVID level. So if you look at 2020, market was at 150 million smartphones, and it is still at like 4 years down the line at 153 million. So even the smartphone market didn't increase at the level everyone expected. China, in a sense, is close to like 270 million with the same population. So we still have some room to for growth in this segment. But at the same time, that's something which everyone missed, and I believe we are sitting at the excess capacity because of that, and then maybe partly due to the PLI.
Tarun, it was a pleasure speaking with you as always. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much.